I hope I shall always possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of titles, the character of an honest man, George Washington once wrote to a young Alexander Hamilton. As well as to prove, he added, what I desire to be considered in reality that I am. Good evening. I'm Matthew Spaulding, the Associate Vice President and Dean of Educational Programs for Hillsdale College here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. The relationship between virtue and statesmanship, as the quote from Washington attests, is central to the very idea of citizen statesman. What are those virtues that are essential to that true greatness? This evening, I must say we are very pleased, proud really, though I'd have to say humbly proud, or perhaps proudly humble, to host the book launch of our colleague, David Bobb. To formally introduce Dr. Bobb, please welcome Ms. Tori Cooney. Tori is from Louisville, Kentucky. She's currently a senior at Hillsdale, where she is majoring in English. She is involved in many things on campus, opera, jazz, the history honorary. As you might expect, she is a good writer, from what I can tell. She is in our journalism program and is a staff writer for the student paper, The Collegian. I have been subjected to her hard and difficult interviews and can attest to her prowess. And keep in mind that my comments are off the record. Tori's here on the WIP program and is currently interning for Humanities, which is the magazine of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tori.
I would also like to welcome you all to the Kirby Center, and I have the honor of introducing you to David J. Bobb. He is the Executive Director of Citizen Education for Hillsdale College and a lecturer in politics. I get to read that one. He's also the founding director of 2 national centers for Hillsdale. This one, fondly known as the Alan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, but also the Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, a civic education program. In addition to that, he's a contributing editor to the U.S. Constitution, a reader, has written on an astounding number of topics for an astounding array of national publications that include the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, Fast Company, and the Claremont Review of Books. And he has spoken to audiences in 25 states, so pressure's on. He received his BA from Hillsdale College and his PhD in political science from Boston College. And so I humbly introduce David J. Bobb.
Thank you very much, Tori. Thank you, Matt. And thank you all for being here this evening. It's wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues who are dedicated to keeping pride in its proper place. It's a hard thing to do, especially here in Washington, D.C., to check humility at the door. Last I investigated, the Humility Caucus in Congress it's still seeking a quorum. There's actually a lot of humility talk these days, and of course a lot of it comes from politicians. Ever notice that the loudest exclamations of humility come on Election Day? In winning his U.S. Senate seat recently in the state of New Jersey, Cory Booker just pledged himself to what he called the, quote, hard, humble work of that office. U.S. House Speaker John Boehner, upon assuming that office, talked a number of times in that speech about how important it was to recover humility. Although it wasn't an election day, President Barack Obama, on the National Day of Prayer in 2013, spoke about how we as a nation and as individuals need to recover the virtue of humility. The more we talk about humility, however, the more arrogant and arrogance we seem to see all around us. In the recent book about Washington insiders, This Town, author Mark Leibovich, who is the New York Times chief national correspondent, uses more than 20 references, phrases really, that begin with the word self. Let me give you a couple of the examples. Self-inflated, self-intoxication, self-reverential, self-dealing. The list goes on and on and on. In an era of selfies, me-note speeches. Remember Chris Christie's speech at the Republican National Convention, right? A keynote that turned into a me-note. And an overwhelming culture of narcissism, self-absorption, and self-promotion. We can't help but wonder whether we're living today in an age of arrogance. This reminds me, before I go any further into my brief remarks this evening, my publisher, Thomas Nelson, which is part of HarperCollins, wanted me to offer a message to you all. I better do this before I forget it. Please follow me on Twitter. Like me on Facebook. Pin me on Pinterest. Take an Instagram photo of me. Take a photo of the book for Instagram. Take a photo of yourself for Instagram. Send a Vine about me. Connect with me via Google+. Then, and only then, send me your clout score so that I should see if I should have anything to do with you based upon your online influence. Actually, my publisher has been wonderful, and I do want to, before saying anything else, express my gratitude to my editor, Joel Miller, and his colleagues, Heather Sexton, Kim Boyer, Emily Lineberger, and everyone else at Thomas Nelson who has brought this book into existence. As long as I'm offering thanks, I must mention, and gladly mention, the wonderful contribution of my wife, Anna, who's standing in the back. Not only is she, thank you. She's an exacting editor, immovable and rigorous, but loving in every other way. About the time that we were finishing up this volume a few months ago, our two boys were delighted at the prospect of it being done. The older one, 4, said to the younger 2 that what we should do in celebration, this was in the winter months, what we should do in celebration is start a fire as big as Daddy's head. Now, I don't know really where this came from, and whether or not my son was trying to tell me something. I can assure you, I think, that there is no ironclad 12-step program for becoming humble. There might not be a 12-step program or plan, but that didn't stop Benjamin Franklin from coming up with what was really a kind of 13-part plan for what he called moral perfection. Let me say just a few words about that, and by way of introduction to James Madison and Frederick Douglass, the two figures that I wanted to focus on this evening. So Franklin, as a 20-something, looked about his life and saw a lot of disorder. He saw a lack of frugality, a kind of lot of time wasting around his endeavors, and he sought to go about a rigorous way of becoming a better human being. He pulled together 12 different virtues like temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, and the list went on, that he was going to systematically work on. If he made a mistake in one of those, if he erred and did not live up to the high standard that he was setting, he would mark a little black mark in his book. Now, when he drew up this list, he went to a friend of his and said, "Have I captured the things that I ought to work on?" His friend, a Quaker, said, "You know, you're kind of arrogant." As Franklin put it, he kindly informed me that I was generally thought proud, that my pride showed itself frequently in conversations. Well, to his credit, Franklin adopted humility so that he had a baker's dozen then of virtues to work on. The injunction that he gave to himself was imitate Jesus and Socrates. An interesting injunction. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. The humble person must acknowledge that he is not self-made, nor at the center of the universe. Unblinkered self-knowledge reveals our imperfections. Humility requires that we admit when we are wrong and then change course. It's the soul state of self-knowledge in which we put others ahead of ourselves in thought, word, and deed, despite our tendency to self-aggrandizement. Now, what Franklin realized in the process of going through this project of sort of moral perfection was that humility was the one of those 13 that most bedeviled him. but it was the one that paid him a great deal of rewards. For as an old man in his 80s reflecting on what a lifetime of working on that virtue meant, he realized that it had made him slower to criticize, slower to interject, more quick to want to win the person over and not just prevail in the argument. He realized that there was something, and always something, very important about insisting upon your fallibility and recognizing, but not being quick to point out the imperfections of others. Now, there's a kind of dilemma that he came to, though, because there's no real mastery ever of humility. As Franklin put it, if I could conceive that I had completely overcome my pride, I should probably become proud of my humility. You see the dilemma there? Franklin's dilemma was America's dilemma. It still is. How to become humble, how to stay humble, and at the same time, be great. How do you uphold that achievement of greatness and maintain humility? Muhammad Ali had his own reflection on that particular challenge. It's hard to be humble, he said, when you're as great as I am. Humility is hard to achieve even when you're not the greatest. It's more difficult to be great and humble at the same time. And I think that takes us to George Washington, the person who we perhaps most associate with the idea of greatness of soul, both he in the American context and Abraham Lincoln. George Washington we think of, though, as a sort of man of pre-made perfection. That's incorrect. He was a person that wrestled with great temptations. No one is naturally humble, and it certainly did not come by nature to George Washington. What he had to do was overcome the temptation to self-aggrandizement. As a young man, he wanted renown. He wanted to be famous. He wanted to be the greatest. But in pursuit of power, renown, and greatness for its own sake, it was elusive for him. It was difficult to achieve. When he reoriented his sights and set them upon the common good, he realized that then the lasting achievement of greatness might be possible. He had to beat back his ego, channel it. It wasn't as if Washington ever gave up being ambitious. He was ambitious throughout his life. But what he had to come to was ambition for the right things, for the things that mattered. When he was at the pinnacle of his power, Washington gave it up, a real test of humility. When he was at the Constitutional Convention, when things were not, as we now see with hindsight, foreordained for success, right? When those delegates wondered in the first month whether in fact they would succeed in their endeavor, having failed before to amend and change the Articles of Confederation, to put the United States on a solid foundation, Washington said this: "We can lay the foundation, but the community at large must raise the edifice." We can raise the foundation, he said of his fellow founders, but the community at large must raise the edifice. What I'd like to talk about very briefly is how James Madison can point us to what laying the foundation means, and how Frederick Douglass, in a very different but related way, might help us understand how we can raise the edifice. Madison was, as a grown man, not 100 pounds soaking wet. He was a hypochondriac throughout his life, and when he wasn't feigning illness, he was often actually sick. He was a man that stood 5 feet 3 inches in height. He had a small voice. When he wasn't taking the notes like he usually did, he wrote the best notes at the Constitutional Convention by far, even though there was a full-time secretary. When he wasn't taking the notes, very often there would be a gap in the records of what Madison himself was saying, for they could not hear him. He spoke so quietly. Early in his life, and throughout his career really, he was alleged to have been what the ancients would have called pusillanimous, not really living up to greatness, not living up even to a reasonable standard of success. He was seen as meek, mild, weak, and wimpy, kind of the way that humility is seen today. It's a virtue for wimps. That's often the characterization. Now, Madison was, despite all of this, a man of prodigious talent. When he went off to college, at the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, he finished his work in half the normal time, in 2 years rather than 4. He stayed on an extra semester to read Hebrew, his 5th language, with the president of that college, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, John Witherspoon. Upon completing that study, having driven himself into a state of exhaustion in that extra semester, he returned to Montpelier, where he was promptly saddled with the unenviable task of tutoring his siblings. He felt, like some young people do today, returning to home after graduating from college, like his life had no meaning. He was utterly bored and without a purpose. As he put it, he did not, quote, expect a long or healthy life. He had, quote, little spirit and alacrity to set about anything that is difficult in acquiring and useless in possessing after one has exchanged time for eternity, end quote. In other words, he had no idea what he was going to do with his life. How did he figure it out? Well, Madison looked around him, and he saw Baptists in the neighboring county besieged for their religious belief, held in a place where they could not practice religion freely by the prevailing established religion. That ignited something in the young James Madison. It set him on a quest to become the one who would stand in the gap for people when their rights, God-given rights, were trammeled. In his dejected state of mind, Madison was unable to see how well his makeup and education had prepared him for a career in politics. Just as the body of a world-class runner looks as if it is built for speed, Madison's intellectual form was fitted perfectly for legislative politics. His physical presence might have been anemic, but his political presence developed over time was strong. His political modus operandi never relied upon overawing power, rhetorical pyrotechnics, or charismatic cajolery. Rather, his way was thorough. Study, share the results of your studies, and get ahead, get out in front of the debate to come. Anticipation and timing are the fast twitch muscles of political work, and Madison succeeded over and over again in knowing where to be the moment of political need had risen. By the time he left politics, he had served in elective office for more than 30 years. His race was an ultramarathon, not a sprint. What did he accomplish? In the book, I go through the really amazing record of how he and his elder friend and colleague of 8 years, Thomas Jefferson, collaborated to bring an end to that, or at least to put on course of ultimate extinction that religious bigotry in their home state of Virginia. And in so doing, to do that in the rest of the United States. Their work, which preceded the adoption of the First Amendment, but also led to it, ensured that religious liberty would be a legacy for centuries to come. In the course of achieving this monumental accomplishment, Madison displayed an intellectual humility. That says that truth does not need the backing of the state to win, right? You don't need to have an established religion. It's going to be counterproductive anyway. He displayed a kind of religious humility that says people should not be coerced into salvation, right? By Christianity's own lights, Madison argued, it wouldn't make sense to do it by point of sword, right? Why would you do that to your fellow citizens? Thirdly, he displayed a kind of political humility that says the sovereign cannot repeal conscience, and so it should not try to do so. At the end of his battle, that epic battle for religious liberty in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Madison allowed himself a little boast. It was one that he offered to Thomas Jefferson in a letter. And he said that their bill for establishing religious freedom had, quote, in this country extinguished forever the ambitious hope of making laws for the human mind, end quote. It took a person like James Madison to make that kind of thing happen. And in that, we see the kind of statecraft that he put into effect in the Constitution as a whole. That kind of care. Every day at the Constitutional Convention, James Madison was there front and center, not only being the third most talkative, right? And that's, you don't get credit just for talking, right? But really substantive. That's what Madison was. But he also recorded the notes. He recorded the conversation, and he was ready the next day again for the debate. It was his foresight in coming to the conclusion that the Articles of Confederation had to go that paved the way for the adoption of the United States Constitution. And in so many ways, he earned the title, the Father of the Constitution. In that, we see the example of what Washington talked about, the laying of the foundation. That foundation, we know, was one that I would argue is really quite a humble one. It was one that said the government had to be limited. That did not mean that it was to be weak. It was to be limited but purposeful. The things that it was charged to do in the Constitution, it had to do well. It had to be strong, mainly to defend the individual rights of human beings, of all Americans. Now that takes us, if we can fast forward then, to the raising of the edifice to Frederick Douglass. You know, part of the challenge of humility and coming to be a humble person is maintaining a healthy pride. This Madison had to do, and also Frederick Douglass had to do in his own life. For more than any of the other four characters that are featured in this book, George Washington, Abigail Adams, Madison, and Abraham Lincoln, you have in Douglass a man who had to overcome extraordinary humiliation. In the same year in which Illinois became a state and in which Abraham Lincoln's mother died, Frederick Douglass was born. He never knew for sure the day of his birth or the month. For a while, he was even unsure about the year. His best guess was that he was born in February 1818. Officially, his mother named him Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He later used the surname Stanley, then Johnson, and then finally Douglas. He added an S at the end after Sir Walter Scott's poem, Lady of the Lake, and the figure in that poem. He did not know the identity of his father, but it was probably his first master, Aaron Anthony, a white man who served as chief overseer of properties for Colonel Edward Lloyd, one of Maryland's wealthiest men. Young Freddie hardly knew his mother, who lived on a neighboring farm, and she died before he turned 8 years old. His early years, he wrote in one of the 3 autobiographies he penned, lacked, quote, an intelligible beginning. He didn't own his first pair of pants until he was about 7. And in one particularly gripping incident that he relates in his early life, one of the only encounters he had with his mother, she came unannounced only to see Douglass locked in a battle with one of those who, although a fellow slave, was charged with feeding him, and she was depriving him of food. Douglass was arguing for his claim of the day's rations, and his mother came upon this awful scene, only to intervene on his behalf. What he wrote is that was the first time in his life that he ever felt somebody had pled his case, had stood for justice in his life. And it brought within him the first stirrings of pride, for he felt that somebody cared about him, that his mother actually loved him. Now, she lived far enough away, 13 miles I think it was, that in making that round trip, she had to return that same night. It constituted a kind of full marathon, 26 miles of maternal love. Slavery, what Douglass knew for the first major part of his life, was a self-perpetuating cycle of disordered pride and debased conduct. What he called the, quote, soul-crushing and death-dealing character of slavery, end quote, was given rise to by an arrogance that wishes others to work for one's own gain. Humiliation is the means by which this end is accomplished. Let me relate one of the most harrowing incidents of humiliation that Douglass talked about in his autobiographies. There was an old slave named Old Barney. He was about as old as his imperious owner. This is what Douglass writes. These 2 men were both advanced in years. There were the silver locks of the master and the bald and toil-worn brow of the slave, superior and inferior here, powerful and weak here, but equals before God. Old Barney, described by Douglas as possessing, quote, a respectful and dignified bearing, was the keeper of the Lloyd stable, along with his son, young Barney. Obsessed with his horses, the owner was always finding fault with their care. After noting some perceived infraction of the stable rules by old Barney, Lloyd ordered the old slave to kneel. He then delivered 30 lashes with his horsewhip. Douglas had watched countless whippings, but at this one he was shocked to see the spectacle of an aged man, and here again I'm quoting from Douglas, a husband and a father humbly kneeling before his fellow man, taking the lashes patiently with no resistance, responding to each blow with only a shrug of the shoulders and a groan. What young Freddie Bailey witnessed in that incident, he later said, was slavery in its truest color. Now you can see for him that the idea of humility took on, in one sense, a very problematic meaning, right? For it connoted a kind of humiliation. Humility comes from the word that relates to the earth, right? Humus, dirt, to be forced back into that place. That's what Douglas knew. He slept on the ground as a slave. What he saw is a pride that he wanted to be able to have in who he was. He knew that there was a dignity in him, in his mother, in that man, old Barney. But every day, buttressed by theological arguments, he was told that there was none. What he had to do was recapture in his life that sense of worth. He had to gain at the same time that he gained the healthy pride. He had to uphold a humility. Now, how did he do this? Well, Douglas was a very intelligent young man and came to a place where he could help teach himself even how to read. He was also brought along by the wife of one of his slave owners when he was sent off to Baltimore. And what happened as he learned to read was a kind of intellectual awakening. His slave masters saw that. If he learns to read the Bible, his master said in Baltimore, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. That's exactly what Douglas wanted to happen. He wanted to be unfit for slavery. When he read the Bible, when he read the book that meant so much to him, that told tales of people gaining their freedom, of George Washington leading this nation into freedom, Douglas realized that there was something very much higher than his own existence, something that he could strive for and achieve. Now, what happened after they realized that he was being made unfit for slavery is that they sent him to be broken by the worst slave breaker in the eastern shore of Maryland. He had to walk 7 miles to this man's place, and at the time he was 16, and he reflected on how much his own life was subject to the whims of others. Where in the world would Frederick Douglass end up? Now, what's important to note at this juncture is that even as he was beginning to have this intellectual awakening, there was also a moral stirring in his own life. For what he realized is that if he was going to gain his liberty, he was going to have to come to a kind of recognition of his own worth. He was told that by design of God, he was to be a slave. He also had to come to a kind of spiritual awakening. As Frederick testified, this spirit, this awakening within him, made me a free man in fact, though I still remained a slave in form. In other words, he was still enslaved in body. He still had to endure that existence, but the stirrings that had happened in his heart had readied him for the liberty that he soon would win. He gained what Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian dissident, called a point of view. That point of view that says a tyranny cannot lay claim to your soul, that they might be able to have claim to your body, that they might be able to tyrannize your day-to-day activities, but ultimately they can't have who you are, who you really are. Now, what Douglas resolved to do at this point was to resist the predations of this slave breaker. This man liked particularly to lie in wait so that once Douglas did one little thing wrong in the day, he would jump out, leap on him, and beat him half to death. And the day that Douglas resolved that he would no longer take this, he said he would resist it in physical form. Now, of course, by this point, he was a strong man, and he could have put down that guy probably. But when that guy leapt out at him, and Douglas resisted, putting, of course, his life in great threat, the slave breaker called upon everybody around him, the other slaves, people that were working for him, to come to his aid. None did. Douglas had resisted him successfully, and after that, he was never touched by that man again. It took him another 6 months before he gained his liberty, before he escaped, before he ran away. But once he did, then he was on his way to becoming one of America's greatest orators and indeed statesmen. He was discovered by William Lloyd Garrison, an abolitionist. He rose to prominence. He became one of America's leading journalists. He spoke all over the country, including twice on the campus of Hillsdale College. People sometimes doubted whether Douglas had ever been enslaved. They said he was too articulate to have been enslaved. And he replied, "If you don't believe me, you can see the diploma that's written on my back." Douglas came to a place of real prominence in this nation. His advocacy was on behalf of all who were oppressed. And he came to a dilemma that I think has some relevance for us today. This is the dilemma. Do you stand on the Constitution of the United States? Do you say that the constitutional foundations, those humble foundations that Madison made, that they are worth standing on and that they'll be the means by which slavery could be ended? Or do you say with William Lloyd Garrison that the Constitution was a compact with the devil, that it was a blood-soaked covenant, that it was something that was so corrupt you couldn't have anything to do with? The question was whether you ought to engage in politics, pursue political compromise, or abandoning all of that, insist upon a purity that called the Constitution bankrupt. Early in his career, Douglas was part of the Garrisonian school. Later, he came to the place where Lincoln was, insisting that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were our only sure foundation for putting slavery on course of ultimate extinction. He came to this realization in one very pregnant and dramatic moment, but he handled it, this announcement, this break from his fellows, the people who had discovered him, William Lloyd Garrison and the Garrisonians, by announcing in his newspaper, change of opinion. After 2 years plus of soul-searching, Douglas now believed that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and he was able to address his fellow citizens as just that, fellow citizens. Before that time, he wondered, was this country's founding worth defending? But what he came to in this kind of Lincolnian recognition of the goodness and greatness of our founding was that he had something to stand on as he fought slavery. In 1860, Douglas said this, here I quote, "What then is the Constitution? It is no vague, indefinite, floating, unsubstantial ideal something, colored according to any man's fancy, now a weasel, now a whale, and now nothing." 3 years after that time, Douglas was on the campus of Hillsdale College. Best as we can tell, he gave a speech that focused on two figures, William Lloyd Garrison and Abraham Lincoln. The date was the third week of January, 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation had just come into effect. Can you imagine what that meant for Frederick Douglass, that thing for which he had worked hard, so arduously fought for? And here he was giving recognition to Lincoln for this mammoth accomplishment that in order for Lincoln to do, he had to stand nearly as a party of one, besieged from every side. When Douglas spoke at the dedication of the Lincoln statue that is not but a mile from here at Lincoln Park, he reflected upon the goodness and greatness of Abraham Lincoln. When he spoke on the campus of Hillsdale College, one of the things that he said is, "A single individual armed with truth is a majority against the world." So, back to today. What do Madison and Douglas teach us about humility and healthy pride? I think we have before us a challenge to recover a sense of pride in our nation's history, recognizing that a return to founding principles does not mean the abandonment of progress. In fact, it's the best means of assuring the kind of progress that matters most. This is not progress with a capital P, the kind of progress where you're trying to get on the right side of history. It's not the kind of progress that has been pushed for the last 100 years by progressives, but a very different idea. The founders talked quite a lot, Washington included, about the idea of progress, the possibility of human achievement. Humility isn't a dour and downward thing. It's not self-despising. It's not self-debasement. What it does is tempers one's ambition. It makes one more realistic about the possibilities, but it certainly doesn't act as a depressant to human achievement. To regain the proper humility about our national purpose, we have to come to a better sense of what government's role should be in our lives. For I think one of the main ways that we see arrogance around us all today is in the kind of omnicompetence of Washington, D.C., the purported omnicompetence, that it can do everything, and that if it can't do everything, all that we need is a little bit of a kind of technical fix. They're just glitches on the road to history with a capital H or progress with a capital P. I have here Forbes' most recent issue. It just came out with its most powerful people. The big news was that Vladimir Putin is ranked #1 and President Obama #2. But if you look to the way that they introduced this list of 72, they explain why they came up with that number. There are 7.2 billion people on the planet. These are the 72 who matter. Now, in writing a book extolling the recovery of humility, I don't expect that we'll see a list of the most humble leaders anytime soon. As Franklin might have reminded us, that would kind of defeat the purpose. But it's not the case that there are 72 people who matter on the planet. The people who matter on this planet are the people who are on this planet. Our cause, Benjamin Franklin said, is the cause of all nations. The exceptional thing about America is that the promise of liberty and equality for all is rooted in a humility about human nature. It's combined with a confidence in the possibilities for human achievement. Greatness of soul guides the gaze of individuals to the heights. Humility issues a warning against flying too high. There's no guarantee, though, of national greatness. The arrogance of our age supposes that prosperity is perpetual and that success is inevitable. America's history of hard-won humility and healthy pride tells us otherwise. As individuals and as a people, we would do well to rediscover our greatest virtue. Thank you. Thanks very much. I think we have a time for a few questions or objections. Yes, Milton?
Yeah, I quit watching the Olympics a few years back because I got so embarrassed when the American teams would carry on like totally boastful, arrogant winners, and when they lost, a bunch of spoiled children, whereas other countries, were well behaved. And so you talk about it as American virtue. I feel like once upon a time it was, but I begin to wonder. But do you feel like there's a religious component to it? Because humility is, of course, a Christian virtue. It was not a pagan virtue. And in a post-Christian world, you worship, well, you worship yourself. What's your thought about the religious component to a revival of humility in America? Is there one?
I think there certainly is. One of the touchstones of I think this question about humility and greatness is precisely as you mentioned, the difference between the Christian conception of the virtue and its notable absence from many of the ancient classical positions. In Aristotle's depiction of the magnanimous man, you don't see anything quite resembling humility. And you might think of it this way. He gives a kind of portrait of the magnanimous man, this person that is great and knows that he's great. Right off the bat, that doesn't sound like somebody that is particularly humble. The ancients were eminently aware of the problem of hubris and the revenge of nemesis, right? So they were not in any way saying that an unhealthy pride could work at all. It's just very hard to imagine, for example, the magnanimous man stooping to wash the feet of those around him, or doing what today Pope Francis did with that man who had the deformed face, right? Embracing him, kissing that man who had been a kind of outcast throughout his life, right? That's the kind of thing that the Christian idea of mercy, clemency, and compassion, which literally means to suffer with, brings. And I think there's a lot of that kind of leavening that came into the American founding. Because the American founding is a kind of combination of that aspiration to greatness along the Aristotelian terms, combined with the idea that we ought to be and must be a good people in order to be great. And there's a tension, though. And that theoretical tension, I think, has an imperfect resolution in theory, right? Aquinas tried to bring it to a kind of place where he said, look, humility and magnanimity are twins. And there's a way in which you could make that argument. But the theoretical irresolution finds a kind of interesting counterpart in reality. For the 5 figures, and perhaps there's more, I just focused on 5, combine in their own souls humility and greatness. And that's a really rare thing. It's extraordinarily rare that you can find individuals that have that combination. And I think that in each their own way, George Washington, Abby Adams, James Madison, and Lincoln and Frederick Douglass did that thing. Yes, Jeff.
Building on that question from Milton, was Alexander the Great great?
Well, you know, it's indisputable that when you've done what he did by the age of 33, you've accomplished something almost literally unparalleled in history, probably unparalleled. When Lincoln, as a young man, not yet 30, is making a speech in Springfield, Illinois about the perpetuation of our political institutions, he pointed to the example of Alexander as somebody that would disdain the beaten path, right? There's no way that Alexander the Great is ever going to be satisfied with running for a city council seat, right? This guy has global aspirations, right? And he was only going to be satisfied by conquest. What's greater, though, than Alexander the Great? That's the question that Lincoln was asking in this speech, even as a young man. Could you free the slaves or enslave free men? He looked at those as the 2 alternatives. And he looked back to George Washington as far greater than any other figure in ancient history. Because George Washington might have done it very differently. In fact, it wouldn't have been surprising at all had Washington, when he was granted twice the powers literally of a dictator during the Revolutionary War, had not abided by the strictures, thrown them off, become dictator for life, right? The founders did not have a high regard, most of them, for Caesar, but rather for Brutus and Cassius, right? They were liberty lovers. They worried in that regard about the kind of Roman Republic. Their main preoccupation, and the reason that Washington, I think, really earned the title of American Cincinnatus, was how do you make sure that their project, our project, doesn't degenerate into empire? And if you can pull that off, you would be the greatest of all. But you'd be great for the right reasons, right? Not conquest, but liberty. Yes, David.
You mentioned in your book that pride is not the opposite of humility. Would you explain?
Right. So I think the sort of caricature of humility, insofar as we think of it today, we think of it as this kind of insipid, weak thing. You know, people that are successful would never be humble because you have to give up so much, right? Kanye West, the noted philosopher, said, you know, why is everybody telling us to be humble? What about being amazing? By that he meant they're opposites, right? And I think that's the way most people think. If you're humble, you're going to be, you know, kind of quiet, shy, retiring. Basically, you're going to get rolled over by everybody else. And so I think that humility is not that. It actually does have a real strength to it. But it cannot be devoid of pride, right? Pride in and of itself is something that does come naturally to us, right? Humility does not. I mean, if you watch a little kid, the first time that they roll over and finally have that first time that they sit up, they look like they've just done the most amazing thing on the planet. And they look around to you until you look back at them and give them that look or tell them, we're so proud of you, right? They want that kind of recognition. And some of that recognition is healthy. You can have a proper pride, in other words. You can't have a proper arrogance. Pride can run amok. It can go too far. And I think that's the challenge that we have with patriotism. It's the challenge that we have in a lot of areas of life. How do you rein in the pride so that it's healthy? A lot of times today, Americans don't know why they love their country. And we've kind of lost our patriotic spirit. Sure, there's the kitsch and the 4th of July stuff, but we don't really know what we're celebrating. President's Day, right? Around our classrooms, you ring all of the pictures of every president as if they've all been equal. So I think that, I hope that goes to answering your question, that healthy pride, that thing that Madison, and for that matter, Frederick Douglass both had to discover, is just as important as that humility.
We have time for one last question.
Okay. Linwood?
Certainly, David, I applaud the work that you do here at Kirby Center and Hillsdale for intellectually making the case for humility and for intellectual strength and integrity in America. I think of humility also being a spiritual virtue. How do we reinstill that back into the culture so that it becomes a cultural renewal, as you said, not a regression, not a looking backward, but that prospective cultural influence, and to have that kind of a dynamic impact in America.
Right. I think one of the first steps, if one is to try to become humble, both as either as an individual or insofar as it's possible as a people, is to recognize that we're not self-created. There has to be something beyond the autonomous I, beyond that ego that we see so much paraded online, but in every other facet of our life, right? The Declaration of Independence speaks intentionally about the idea of a creator God, and that implies by necessity that we are creatures. And that's not a demeaning place. That's not a humiliated place. It is a place, rather, where one can recognize if you're not your own lawgiver, if there are such things as the laws of nature and of nature's God, then there's something besides your own internal conscience. We've been looking at, with my class this semester, at various virtues that might be necessary for statesmanship. And we talked a little bit about the idea of conscience. Today, when there's a vote of conscience on the Hill, it means that all debate stops. You just lay that trump card down and you say, this is a vote of conscience, all argument stops. And so we've gone to the place where somehow we've taken any hint of religion to mean that debate and reason stops. So I think part of the recovery here of a spiritual sense of humility, paradoxically enough, is a recovery of reason. Faith and reason working together. That's the way that the founders put things. And it's the way that we will, I think, be most effective in winning over our fellow citizens. But there is that recognition, that deep recognition. Once you take that step and say there's a creator, there's probably then a God that is more active in your life. And I think that's where Washington found himself. I think that's certainly where Lincoln found himself late in life. You know, he had a deepening of his faith. God was inscrutable in some ways, right? You couldn't pinpoint exactly why he was doing what he was. And the purpose was never for Washington or Lincoln to invoke God and say, well, we have God on our side, now we will go do X, Y, and Z. The quest was rather, and I think this really bespeaks their humility, is to figure out how can we be on the side of the divine. Thanks much.
Thank you, and thank you, David, for that wonderful talk. I now invite you to a reception in our entry hall, where David will be signing books, and he's far too humble, but I will say you can buy books, and remember that Christmas is around the corner. Thank you all for coming, and have a nice evening.